I never thought I'd end up here, sitting alone in a dimly lit security booth at the edge of an industrial compound most people in town don't even know exists. If you'd asked me a year ago, I would have told you I had everything together: a steady job, a one-bedroom apartment that felt like mine, enough money to pay the bills and still have some left over for weekends out. But the truth is, things can slide downhill faster than you think, and once they do, it's like trying to climb a cliff of wet stone. The fall started when the company I worked for downsized. They called it restructuring, but it was nothing more than a way to cut costs and keep the shareholders happy. One day I was sitting at my desk sipping burnt coffee, worrying about the usual trivial deadlines, and the next I was packing my things into a cardboard box, carrying it past coworkers who kept their heads down, terrified they'd be next. Unemployment doesn't hit all at once. It creeps in. At first, it feels like an unexpected vacation. I slept in, made lists of things I'd finally get around to doing, convinced myself it was just a matter of weeks before I found something else. But weeks became months. Interviews went nowhere. Bills piled up. My savings bled out of my account in a steady trickle until there was nothing left but overdraft warnings and the metallic taste of panic. That's when I saw the listing. It was simple enough. Night security guard needed, immediate hire, competitive pay. The ad didn't list the company name, just a phone number and a vague description of duties: monitor cameras, perform hourly patrols, file nightly reports. The pay, though, was nearly double what other security jobs offered. It was enough to get me back on my feet, cover rent, and maybe even save. I should have been suspicious right then, but desperation doesn't leave much room for questions. I called, and the man on the other end of the line didn't even hesitate. "Come in tonight," he said. "If you're serious, we'll get you started right away." The facility itself was tucked away at the far edge of town, down a service road most people wouldn't bother with unless they were lost. The first time I drove out there, the air felt different, colder, heavier somehow. The compound rose out of the dark like a concrete carcass, all windowless walls and chain-link fencing crowned with rusted barbed wire. It looked less like a place of business and more like something abandoned, the kind of building you'd see teenagers daring each other to break into. But the lights were on. Faint buzzing fluorescence lit the gatehouse where I was told to report. A man in a cheap suit, his tie pulled loose like he couldn't be bothered to tighten it, sat behind the desk. He introduced himself only as Mr. Grady. His handshake was cold and damp, his smile thin and rehearsed. The interview lasted less than 5 minutes. He slid a manila folder across the desk. Inside were half-filled forms, a generic confidentiality agreement, and a stapled packet labeled Operational Guidelines. "Read it carefully," he said, his eyes flicking to the clock on the wall. "Follow the procedures exactly. This job is simple as long as you don't deviate." I skimmed the packet. Most of it was what you'd expect: check cameras, log patrols, secure doors. But here and there were lines that made me pause. Lines like, "Do not acknowledge movement on camera. 3 after 2:15 a.m. The eastern hallway is off limits after 3:15 a.m. Patrols must reroute accordingly. If you hear knocking on the boiler room door, do not respond." I must have frowned because Mr. Grady's voice cut in sharply. "The rules are not suggestions." "Do you understand?" I nodded. What else could I do? I needed the job, and I told myself it was just eccentric company policy. Maybe there were safety hazards they didn't want to explain. Maybe it was some weird legal liability thing. I signed the forms without reading further. Grady handed me a flashlight, a ring of keys, and a black binder with a shift log inside. "You'll be alone," he said, already standing as if eager to leave. "The cameras cover most of the facility. Walk the ground floor once every hour. Stay out of restricted areas. Don't leave your post unless you have to. Any questions?" I had 1,000, but I shook my head, and that was it. By midnight, I was sitting in the small security booth at the heart of the compound. The room smelled faintly of dust and something chemical, like bleach that had dried years ago. A bank of monitors flickered in front of me, casting pale light across the desk. Most of the feeds showed long, empty corridors lined with heavy doors. A few looked out over the yard, chain-link fences swaying in the wind, cracked pavements stretching into darkness. The silence pressed in. It wasn't the kind of quiet you get late at night in the city. where you can still hear the distant hum of traffic or the occasional bark of a dog. This was a silence so complete it made my ears ring, like the whole building had been buried under the earth. I told myself I was being dramatic, that the unease curling in my stomach was just nerves. First nights always feel strange. I leaned back, forced my breathing to slow, and tried to convince myself this was just another job. Nothing more. But deep down, even then, something told me I'd stepped into a place I wasn't meant to be. The first night wasn't really mine. It was more of an initiation, if you could call it that. Mr. Grady insisted I arrive 2 hours before midnight so he could walk me through the essentials. He wasn't a man of many words. His voice carried the tired cadence of someone who'd repeated the same script countless times, but had stopped caring about how it sounded. He led me through the compound in silence, the beam of his flashlight slicing through dim hallways that smelled of stale air and rust. Every door we passed seemed older than it should have been, their paint blistered, their hinges groaning with the faintest shifts, yet the floors were spotless and the walls bore fresh coats of beige, as though someone was determined to disguise the facility's true age. Grady paused at the base of a stairwell, his hand gripping the rail as though it were the only solid thing in the entire building. "There are things you'll need to remember," he said. His eyes caught mine briefly before sliding away, like he couldn't hold the contact. "Things that aren't optional." He pressed a worn binder into my hands. The front cover was stained, the corners bent. On the inside, taped against the first page, was a neatly typed sheet labeled Rules of Conduct. I read them aloud, each line sounding more absurd than the last. "Do not look directly at camera 6 between 2 a.m. and 2:15 a.m. If movement appears on the third-floor monitors, you are to log the time but make no acknowledgement. The eastern hallway is strictly off-limits after 3:15 a.m. patrols. Must adjust routes accordingly. If you hear knocking at the boiler room door, under no circumstances respond. Should you hear your name spoken over the intercom system, disregard it. The system has been decommissioned." I lowered the binder slowly, waiting for him to laugh or offer an explanation. He didn't. "Is this a joke?" I asked, trying to mask my unease with a thin smile. Grady's lips tightened, but it wasn't amusement. "There's nothing funny about protocol," he said. "Follow them exactly and you'll be fine." "Fine from what?" I pressed. His jaw twitched, the muscles tightening beneath his skin. He looked at the floor as though searching for the right phrase, then simply said, "From mistakes." We walked on, his flashlight beam jittering across blank walls and shadowed corners. I wanted to ask more, wanted to demand an explanation, but something in his tone left no room. It wasn't secrecy born of authority. It was secrecy born of fear. He brought me into the security booth next, a cramped room tucked deep in the building's center. The monitors filled the wall, stacked in 2 uneven rows. Each displayed different parts of the facility. Empty stairwells, silent corridors, locked doors that led nowhere. The hum of electricity in that room was constant, vibrating faintly beneath the floor like the pulse of a living thing. "You'll spend most of your time here," Grady said, placing the binder on the desk with deliberate weight. "Log what you see. Every hour do a patrol on the ground floor. Stay inside. Do not step beyond the perimeter fence unless instructed. If you lose radio contact, remain calm. Backup arrives at dawn." He lingered on that last word. Dawn, like it carried more significance than just the break of daylight. As he spoke, I found my eyes drifting to one monitor in particular. The third-floor feed. It showed nothing but an empty hallway stretching into darkness, doors lining each side like teeth. The light flickered every few seconds as though the bulb was on the verge of dying. Without warning, Grady reached forward and switched it off. The screen collapsed into black. "Don't," he said sharply, his tone cutting through the silence like a blade. "Not that one." "Never stare too long." I felt my throat dry. "Why?" His reply was flat. "Because staring back is rude." I wanted to laugh, to brush it off as an odd attempt at humor, but the seriousness in his voice left no room. A faint chill crawled over my skin, leaving goosebumps in its wake. After the walkthrough, he gave me the key ring again. "You'll learn the routes quickly enough," he muttered, already halfway out the door. "Stick to the rules and this job's easier than it looks." I followed him back to the entrance where he paused under the pale fluorescent lights. His hand hovered over the door handle for a long moment before he finally pulled it open. The night air spilled in, cold and damp, carrying with it the faint odor of wet earth. Grady looked at me one last time. "Don't improvise," he said. Then he was gone, leaving me in the silence. I stood alone, the binder heavy in my hands. I flipped through it again, hoping I'd misread, hoping the rules were just filler. But the words were clear, typed in a font that carried no hint of irony. Each line carried the tone of law. I told myself it didn't matter. Every company had its quirks, its strange traditions or outdated procedures. Maybe these were relics from a previous era, never scrubbed from the manual. Maybe Grady was the type who leaned into old myths to keep new hires in line. That night, when I sat alone in the booth, binder open beside me, I tried to convince myself it was harmless, superstition, bureaucratic nonsense. Nothing more. But in the back of my mind, a thought gnawed quietly. Persistent and sharp, rules only exist when there's something to be afraid of. My first official night on duty began at midnight sharp. Mr. Grady wasn't there this time. No one was. The front gate creaked shut behind me with the hollow clang of iron on iron, and after that, I was alone with the sound of my own footsteps crunching across the cracked pavement. The booth smelled faintly of ozone and paper dust. The monitors flickered to life as soon as I pressed the power strip, filling the cramped room with their pale bluish glow. 12 feeds, each showing different angles of the compound. Long hallways, empty staircases, sealed doors. The images were grainy, as though the cameras hadn't been replaced in decades. I logged the start of my shift in the binder, the pen dragging across the paper with a faint rasp. 00 hours. Cameras online? All clear? The words looked small and meaningless on the page, like they belonged to someone else. The hum of the fluorescent lights overhead blended with the quiet static of the monitors until the room itself seemed to vibrate. It wasn't loud, but it was constant. A sound you stop noticing only because it burrows into your skull and becomes part of the silence. For the first half hour, I just sat there, watching. The feeds didn't change. Not a flicker of movement, not even a shift in the shadows. I could hear the building groaning faintly around me, pipes expanding, metal settling, but otherwise it felt sealed off from the world, as though nothing outside existed anymore. At 1 a.m., I took the flashlight and began my first patrol. The ground floor stretched in long corridors lined with identical doors. My footsteps echoed back at me, hollow and delayed, like someone was walking just behind. The air was cool and dry, tinged faintly with the smell of rust and something chemical I couldn't place. Every so often, I'd pass a vent that exhaled cold air across my skin, sharp enough to raise goosebumps. I checked each door in turn, rattling handles that were all locked, peering into small reinforced windows that showed nothing but darkness. By the time I looped back to the booth, nearly 40 minutes had passed. My logbook entry was quick, mechanical. 0145, ground floor patrol complete. No issues. Back in the chair, I leaned closer to the monitors, trying to ignore the growing tightness in my chest. That was when I noticed the first glitch. Camera 4, which covered a side corridor near the east wing, fuzzed with static for less than a second. When the picture returned, the hallway seemed darker than before. I leaned forward, squinting, certain I was imagining it. But as the seconds ticked by, the light over the corridor flickered weakly, as though struggling to stay alive. I switched my focus to another feed, then back again. Nothing. Just the same empty corridor. Old equipment, I muttered to myself, writing a note in the log. 0152. Camera 4 flicker, static. Possibly hardware issue. But the longer I watched, the more I felt the hairs rise on the back of my neck. At 2:30, another patrol. The silence seemed thicker this time. My footsteps were too loud, bouncing off walls that felt too narrow, too close. A faint drip echoed somewhere far off, irregular but sharp, as if water was leaking from pipes overhead. I tried to track it, but it always seemed just around the next corner. Never closer, never farther. I checked the eastern hallway last. Even though it wasn't yet past 3:15, the cutoff in the rules, I felt reluctant to approach it. Something about that corridor was different. Even from a distance, the air seemed heavier there, as though the shadows had weight. I stopped short of stepping in, shining my flashlight across the linoleum floor. The beam vanished into the dark, swallowed faster than it should have been. "Empty," I whispered, though no one was there to hear it. When I returned to the booth, I sat in front of the monitors again, staring at the screens. At 3 a.m., the third-floor feed flickered briefly, just static like before. The lights overhead buzzed louder, almost angrily. I remembered Grady's warning about not staring too long at that camera, and forced myself to look away. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had moved in the split second of distortion. Something just out of sight. The rest of the night passed in that strange rhythm: patrol, log entry, cameras, silence. Nothing out of place, yet nothing at ease either. By dawn, my eyes burned from staring at screens that revealed nothing. I shut them down one by one, the glow shrinking until the booth was left in gray morning light. When I walked out, the compound looked different. The air felt heavier, the silence even deeper. It was just a job, I reminded myself. Just cameras and empty halls. But I couldn't ignore the way my own reflection in the booth's window lingered a heartbeat longer than it should have before turning away. The second night felt easier at first. I'd survived the first shift without incident, logged my reports properly, and convinced myself that most of what unsettled me could be explained away by nerves, faulty wiring, or old equipment. That's what I told myself anyway as I sat back down in the booth with a thermos of coffee and the binder open beside me. The monitors flickered in their familiar pale blue. Empty corridors, locked doors, stillness. But by 2 a.m, I started noticing something different. Camera 7, which looked down a long storage hall, showed what I thought was a dark shape near the far end. At first I assumed it was a trick of the grainy feed, some artifact of the camera lens, but when I leaned closer, the shape remained. A tall silhouette, motionless. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, looked again. The figure hadn't moved, hadn't vanished. Just stood there, far down the hall, too still to be natural. I stared at it until the monitor glitched, static washing across the screen for half a second. When the image cleared, the figure was gone. I checked the time, 2:13 a.m. I wrote it in the log. My handwriting shaky, 2:13 a.m. Possible interference. Shadow on camera 7. When I went on patrol a few minutes later, I forced myself down the storage hall. The lights above hummed, but the corridor itself was empty. Nothing waiting at the far end, no evidence anyone had been there. The next night it happened again. Different camera this time, camera 9, overlooking a stairwell landing. The same silhouette appeared, this time standing just out of the light's reach, tall and indistinct. And again, it was exactly 2:13 a.m. I felt a tightness in my chest, as though the air itself was pressing down on me. I checked the binder afterward, flipping through the rules again. Nothing mentioned recurring times, nothing about patterns. Yet I knew what I'd seen, even if it was only for a second. By the third night, I was prepared. At 2:12, I leaned forward in my chair, pen ready, eyes locked on the monitors. The hum of the fluorescent lights overhead seemed to grow louder, matching the thump of my heartbeat. Then, right on schedule, it appeared again. This time on camera 4, the same feed that had glitched my first night. The silhouette lingered at the edge of the frame, tall and dark, like a person standing just beyond the reach of the light. And then, as always, static swallowed the screen. When the feed cleared, the corridor was empty. I sat there, pen hovering over the logbook, my skin crawling. 3 nights in a row. Same time, different cameras, but always the same presence. That wasn't equipment failure. That wasn't chance. Something was moving through the building. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe there was a night shift worker somewhere I hadn't been told about. Maybe an intruder who knew how to dodge patrols. But the thought didn't hold. Every door I checked was locked, every hallway empty when I searched. And the silhouette, whatever it was, never moved like a person. It appeared only for seconds, frozen, as though aware of being watched. By the 4th night, I'd begun keeping a separate notebook of my own. I drew crude maps of the facility, marked down times, circled the cameras where the figure appeared. I didn't even realize I was doing it obsessively, not at first. It just felt necessary, like building a language to understand what was happening. I noticed another pattern too. The eastern hallway, the one I was forbidden to patrol after 3:15, looked different on camera than it did in person. In the monitors, the corridor seemed longer. The perspective stretched unnaturally, as though the vanishing point had been pulled farther away. When I walked it in person during my early patrols, the hall was no longer than any other. But on the monitors, it stretched on, lined with too many doors. More doors than I could ever recall counting in person. One night, at 2:13, I thought I saw the silhouette there too, far down the distorted stretch. The static came a heartbeat later, almost as though it had been waiting for me to notice before blotting itself out. The rules said never to enter after 3:15, and I obeyed. But I couldn't stop myself from staring at that monitor, waiting for the distortion to return, the hallway to shift, the figure to reappear. I told myself I wasn't afraid. But the truth was I was becoming obsessed. Every creak of the building during patrols made me stop and listen. Every flicker of the lights made me scan the hallways twice over. My reports grew longer, filled with times and notes no one would ever read. When dawn came, I'd leave with my body aching and my mind buzzing, replaying the images over and over until sleep refused to come. I knew something was there. Something moving through the building at the same time each night, crossing different corridors like it was mapping the place out, or worse, like it was mapping me out. And no matter how much I wrote, no matter how much I convinced myself I was documenting the truth, the thought gnawed deeper and deeper into me. Maybe it wasn't the building being watched, maybe it was me. By the fifth night, the rules felt less like protocol and more like chains. Every time I opened the binder and read through them, they seemed to mock me, short sentences printed in crisp black ink, daring me to question why they existed at all. Do not look directly at camera 6 between 2 a.m. and 2:15 a.m. Do not acknowledge movement on the third-floor monitors. Avoid the eastern hallway after 3:15 a.m. They weren't instructions. They were warnings. And the more I saw the figure, the same silhouette returning at the same time, haunting different cameras, the more the rules felt like walls closing in. I needed answers. The thought gnawed at me. What would happen if I broke one? I lasted longer than I expected. For 4 nights I obeyed, even as the silhouette came and went like clockwork. I logged the times, traced maps in my notebook, circled patterns, tried to convince myself I was still in control. But control doesn't last when curiosity festers. That night, a little after 2, I found myself staring at the third-floor feed again. The hallway stretched into dimness, lined with heavy doors, the overhead light flickering faintly. Empty, harmless, but the rule about it, do not acknowledge movement on the third-floor monitors, echoed in my head. What kind of rule was that? A monitor was just glass, wires, light. There was no reason not to look. I leaned closer, my breath fogging the screen. The glow painted my face pale blue, my reflection faint and ghostly. And then, movement. Not a blur. Not a trick of the lens. Something stepped out from one of the doorways in the hall. It wasn't just a shadow this time. It had shape, height, arms too long, legs that bent slightly wrong. Its face was nothing more than a smear, like the camera lens refused to focus there. But the way it moved, slow, deliberate, made my stomach twist. I froze, pen clutched in my hand, every muscle in my body screaming not to move. The figure stopped halfway down the hall. For a moment, it simply stood there, angled slightly toward the camera as though testing the distance. And then, it turned its head. The blur where its face should have been shifted directly toward me. I couldn't breathe. The screen fuzzed with static for half a second, but when the image cleared, it was still there, still looking, no, staring, at me. I knew it was impossible. A camera was a one-way thing, a feed, not a window, but in that moment, the figure knew I was watching, knew I had broken the rule. My heart hammered against my ribs. I wanted to look away, to switch the monitor off, but my body wouldn't move. My eyes burned, tears pricking the corners, but I couldn't blink. The lights in the booth flickered. The hum in the walls grew louder, vibrating through the floor. The monitor buzzed with faint distortion lines, the figure's outline rippling as though it were pressing against the glass itself. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The hallway stretched empty again, doors closed. Light flickering, I collapsed back in the chair, gasping. My hands shaking so violently I dropped the pen. It clattered to the floor, the sound too loud in the silence. For several long minutes I sat there, paralyzed, staring at the empty feed. My body was soaked with sweat, the back of my neck prickling with cold. Finally, I forced myself to write in the log, 2:11 a.m., 3rd floor, movement acknowledged. Possible figure observed, but I knew it wasn't just possible. I'd seen it. I'd felt it. And worse than that, I knew it had seen me. The rest of the shift dragged like a nightmare. Every creak of the building felt deliberate. Every flicker of the camera sent panic stabbing through me. On patrol, I swore I heard something moving a step behind, always just out of reach of the flashlight. When dawn came, I didn't feel relief. I felt marked. Back at my apartment, I couldn't stop replaying the moment in my mind. The way its head had turned. The blur locking onto me like it was looking not at the hallway, not at the camera, but directly through the glass into the booth, into me. That night, I told myself I wouldn't look again. I'd follow the rules. I'd do what Grady had said and treat them like law. But even as I swore it, I felt something new lingering in the room. A weight. I was no longer just watching the building. Now something inside it was watching me back. After breaking the rule, the building no longer felt the same. It wasn't just that I had seen something on the monitor. It was that it had seen me. From then on, every patrol became an exercise in restraint, in pretending I wasn't listening for footsteps that weren't mine, pretending I didn't feel the shift of air on my neck when the hallways were still. The 6th night began like the others. Sign the log, check the feeds, run the circuit. But already I noticed changes. The cameras glitched more often. Static lines crawled across the screens, warping corners of the hallways, turning shadows into figures. And whenever I passed through the eastern wing, the air carried a sour smell, faint but distinct, like damp wood and rusting metal. At 1:45 a.m., on my first patrol I heard it. Footsteps, not behind me. Exactly, just near. Light, deliberate taps on concrete that echoed faintly through the hall. I froze, flashlight beam trembling against peeling paint and dusty pipes. "Hello?" I called out, voice too thin, too forced. "This is private property. You need to leave." The sound stopped. I swept the light back and forth, heart pounding, nothing, no movement. Just the silence, thick and waiting. I convinced myself it was pipes cooling, the building shifting. But the sound had rhythm. It had weight. By the time I got back to the booth, my shirt clung to my back with sweat. The second patrol was worse. Around 3:10 a.m., I passed through the cafeteria, a wide room with plastic tables bolted to the floor. It always smelled faintly of grease, like food had been cooked there years ago and never aired out. Tonight, though, it smelled stronger, fresher, like something had been fried not an hour before. A chair scraped. I spun, light cutting across the rows of tables. One chair, just one, was pulled half out from its place. It hadn't been like that before. I approached slowly, flashlight trembling. Nothing moved. Nothing stirred, but the chair wasn't dusty. The rest of the room was coated in a fine gray layer, years of neglect. That one chair was clean, as though someone had just sat there. I didn't sit down. I didn't touch it. I just backed away, nearly tripping over my own boots, and hurried out. The rule about the eastern hallway pressed in my mind as the minutes crept toward 3:15. I avoided it, kept my pace steady, but the air seemed to grow heavier near that section of the building, as if something unseen knew I was deliberately steering clear. The rest of the shift blurred in paranoia. Every shadow looked like it moved when I wasn't watching. Every drip of water echoed like a whisper. The 7th night, things escalated. I found my keys missing. I keep them clipped to my belt, standard issue. But during the second patrol, when I reached for them to open the stairwell door, the clip was empty. My heart dropped into my stomach. I retraced my steps, panic surging, knowing if I lost company property, I'd be finished. I found them 30 minutes later, on my desk in the booth. But I hadn't been back to the booth since starting patrol. They were just lying there, neat, centered on the logbook. As though someone had placed them deliberately, the pages of the log were damp under them, the ink of my previous entries smudged into blurry stains. By the 9th night, I stopped trying to explain. I knew something was happening. The footsteps, the chair, the keys, it wasn't coincidence. It wasn't my imagination. Something in the building was playing with me. And then came the eastern hallway, even though I avoided it after 3:15. On the 9th night, I caught sight of something there anyway. It was 2:47 a.m. I was cutting across the second floor, flashlight beam bouncing along cracked tile. When I passed the cross corridor that led to the eastern wing, the rule said nothing about avoiding it before 3:15. Still, I usually kept my distance. But that night I looked. Far down the corridor in the dim light, a figure stood. Not moving. Not walking. Just standing, my throat closed. I froze in place, heart hammering, light fixed on the empty stretch of hall. The figure didn't flicker like a shadow. It didn't blur like a trick of the eyes. It was solid, motionless, silhouetted against the far wall. I blinked hard. When my eyes opened, it was gone. I ran the rest of the patrol, not even bothering to slow my pace. When I got back to the booth, I checked the camera for that wing. The feed glitched for several seconds, white static tearing across the screen, and when it cleared, the corridor looked perfectly empty. The manual's words returned to me like a curse. Avoid the eastern hallway after 3:15 a.m. I had obeyed the time, but maybe the rule wasn't only about the time. Maybe it was warning me about the place itself. From that night on, the unease followed me even beyond the facility. Back at my apartment, I'd wake to faint sounds like something pacing in the hall outside my door. My phone buzzed at 3:15 a.m. once, no number, no message. Just silence on the line when I picked up. I stopped telling myself I was imagining things, because if I was, then why did the building itself seem to know? Why did the rules feel less like guidelines and more like restraints keeping something locked in place? And why, no matter where I went, did I feel like it was already following me? It was the small things that finally convinced me I wasn't losing my mind. Objects moved just enough to be noticed. Patterns repeating with maddening precision. The sense that the building itself had developed a taste for attention. But what really tipped me over was the note. I came in on the 11th night exhausted, eyes raw from hours of monitors and stale coffee. The booth smelled colder than usual, like winter had crept inside and lingered. My hand hovered over the door handle for a second longer than normal. There was a pressure in my chest I couldn't explain. I pushed the glass door open, and the air inside seemed to sigh, as if the room exhaled the moment I entered. On the desk, where I always left my flashlight and the logbook, lay a torn piece of notebook paper. The handwriting was jagged, pressed too hard into the page as if whoever wrote it had been shaking. 3 words scrawled in capital letters filled the page: "Do not stay." Underneath, in smaller letters and a different pen, someone had added, "Past the 12th night." "It knows you now." My stomach dropped. For a moment, I couldn't feel my fingers. I picked the paper up with the tip of my thumb like it might burn. It smelled faintly of cigarette smoke, though the facility forbade smoking years ago. Someone had been here. Someone who'd left a warning and then disappeared into the same silence that had been swallowing the compound for so long. I thumbed through the logbook, half expecting to find a name or an entry that might explain it. There was nothing. No returns to some previous guard's handwriting, no signatures, only my own cramped notes and the official company entries from the previous weeks. I felt suddenly exposed, as if the pages themselves were inadequate to keep the truth. I reported it to Grady the next afternoon under the pretense of routine. "Found this on the desk this morning. You want me to log it?" I tried to keep my voice neutral. He didn't twitch at first, then his expression shuddered like a window being closed. "Someone's messing with you," he said, too quick. His hands hovered over the desk for a second, then he looked away. "Don't engage with it. Throw it away. We don't tolerate pranks here," but he didn't take the paper. He didn't suggest opening an investigation. His eyes avoided mine like a man who'd seen too much and was tired of seeing more. That dismissal made me angrier than the fear did. If there was a note, someone had already been on the inside. Someone who knew whatever I was stumbling into and thought it worthwhile to warn the next person. Either Grady was lying or indifferent, and both possibilities terrified me in different ways. The note was not the only breadcrumb. Over the next few days, I started looking for anything left behind. Receipts, personal effects, old IDs tucked under desks. The building yielded fragments, small, disorienting proof that lives had intersected with this place and then been erased. I pulled archived files from a locked cabinet in the manager's office the day I couldn't stand the waiting any longer. It took a combination of false papers, patience, and a lock I had watched Grady use before to get in. The files were bureaucratic at first. Maintenance reports, equipment invoices, personnel forms. The dates marched forward like a calendar of normalcy until about 5 years back. Entries became intermittent, gaps that widened until the logs were almost blank. Tucked between a stack of supply orders was a thin folder marked Security Personnel. It contained a list of names, dates of employment, and brief notes: AS resigned, JT transferred, MB no-show. One entry was smudged, as if someone had smeared ink with a thumb. Another had a notation that made my stomach twist: unaccounted for. Last seen on site, file closed. I looked at the closed files until numbers and letters blurred. Names without faces, faces without names. There were photographs too. Grainy headshots stapled to reports. Men and women in plain uniforms, solemn, all with the same tired eyes. My own hands felt conspicuously large as I flipped through them, the paper warm under my palms. There was a series of resignation letters, written in carefully polite language. One man wrote of personal reasons, another of family obligations. One letter was simply a typed line, effective immediately. No signature, no forwarding address. At the bottom of one personnel file, someone had written in pencil the words, "Do not stay past the 12th night." The handwriting looked like the jagged script on the note in my booth. I pressed my thumb to the graphite, feeling the roughness like a bruise. I dug deeper, tracing names through county records, contacting a former employee listed as a reference in one of the files. He picked up on the third ring, voice hoarse and disbelieving when I explained who I was and where I worked. "You're with them?" he asked, then after I confirmed, sighed. "You should leave. I quit years ago." He didn't need to say more. The tremor in his voice told enough. Something had happened. Something they'd all tried to look past. His sentences stumbled into silence when I asked what he had seen. "Records get cleaned," he said finally, as if reciting battlefield history. "Companies, they don't like liabilities. They write people off or they spin it into something neat. You keep your head down and you move on, or you don't," and he left the sentence unfinished, which was worse than any description. The idea of a cover-up solidified into a hard, unpleasant truth. Whatever had been happening in that building had been known, at least by some, and the knowledge had been buried under policies, confidentiality agreements, and silence. I started talking to co-workers who'd been at the compound longer. Their faces, when I asked, were guarded, eyes darting to doors and windows, most clammed up, offering that old default of personnel issues and procedural confidentiality. A few admitted off the record that there had been incidents. A broken window repaired hastily at dawn. A maintenance worker found wandering in the yard, muttering about doors that weren't there. Simple things, they said. Tragedies, they insisted. Nothing supernatural. Nothing to worry a paying customer about. But the story didn't add up. If it were merely an accident or two, why all the secrecy? Why rules about cameras in hallways? Why the pencil note tucked away in a staff file? It felt like someone had written an explanation and then hid it. A single name recurred in whispers: Hawthorne. No one would say more than that. Once, when I pressed an older clerk for details, his jaw clenched and he spat the name like a curse. Hawthorne closed things down, took care of the expenses, filed paperwork, cleaned the slate, he complained, voice low. You don't want his kind of help. I tried to find Hawthorne in public records but came up dry. It was as if the name belonged to someone who existed only inside the facility's walls and in the margins of memos. All of this made me tighten around the note's warning, 12 nights. The idea lodged itself in my head like a splinter. I started counting down, not even sure why. 12 turns into 11. 11 into 10. The numbers shrank the world until my life was a narrow path of labeled days. That urgency did something to me. It made me resent the money I'd accepted. It made me resent the agreement I'd signed. It made me resent the way the building seemed to watch and wait, patient as a predator. And yet leaving wasn't simple. Rent was due. The pay was too good to walk away from without a plan. There was a strange sense of obligation, too, like I'd been handed a conversation and couldn't stop listening mid-sentence. The night before the 12th, I took the note and the pencil-worn file to the booth, sat under the monitors and tried to piece together a coherent picture. I wanted to tell myself there was a rational explanation, a disgruntled former employee, a hoax, a cover-up to hide criminal activity. But the evidence refused to be neat. Names dissolved into smudged lines, maps twisted into contradictions, and every explanation bent toward one terrifying possibility. Whatever this place had become, it didn't like to be left. When the sun finally slid below the horizon and the fluorescents hummed awake, the compound took on that familiar predatory stillness. I signed in, hands steadier than I felt. The logbook looked like a countdown now. Nights left, 5, 4, 3, each entry a small defiance. Each line I wrote felt like a record of my own unraveling. At 11:42 p.m., with the note folded under the logbook like a talisman, I turned off the booth light and stepped out into the corridor. The building waited, patient and full of a quiet that pressed against my ears. Somewhere deep in the compound, a door closed on its own and the sound rolled across the hall like a bad omen. I put one foot forward, and the night swallowed me whole. The whispering started. It wasn't words at first, just the texture of sound. Faint, papery, like dozens of voices brushing together behind the walls. I pressed my ear against the door, but the voices weren't outside. They were in the room with me. They seemed to bleed from the shelves themselves, vibrating through the boxes, through the paper. I staggered back, clutching the flashlight. The bulb overhead swayed gently as though stirred by breath, its light sliding across the metal chair. Shadows bent the wrong way across the floor. The whispers grew clearer. Some were guttural, some high-pitched, overlapping, as if multiple conversations were happening at once just beneath understanding. I picked out fragments that felt less like language and more like memory. Turn back. It's waiting. 12. Too late. My watch read 3:42. I couldn't remember how long I'd been standing there. The air grew heavy. My flashlight flickered, the beam shrinking as though the room itself were swallowing light. I backed toward the shelves, scanning for another door, another exit, but the walls seemed to stretch taller, shelves rising higher until they loomed above me like buildings. And then, without warning, the door slammed open. The sound cracked like a gunshot. My flashlight sputtered and died. In the split second of darkness, the whispers rose to a scream, layered voices twisting into a single shriek that rattled the inside of my skull. When the light returned, the doorway was empty. I ran. I didn't think. I clutched the flashlight like a weapon and bolted through the opening, my boots slamming the linoleum. The hallway stretched in both directions, impossibly long, lined with doors that hadn't been there before. Every one of them was unmarked, identical, repeating in eerie precision as though I were trapped in a copy-paste loop of architecture. I sprinted down the corridor, counting doors in a panic, 8, 9, 12, 15, but the end of the hall never came closer. The air pressed against me, thick and suffocating like running underwater. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but the hallway refused to end. Somewhere behind me, footsteps followed, slow, deliberate, unhurried. I didn't look back. My watch buzzed faintly, an alarm I hadn't set. I glanced down, desperate for grounding. The hands read 4:37, but that was impossible. I'd only left the booth minutes ago. The corridor bent without warning. I turned with it and nearly collapsed against the wall. Ahead, faint light spilled across the floor, the security booth. My booth. I sprinted harder than I thought I could, slamming through the door and collapsing into the chair, gasping, heart racing like I'd run miles. The monitors glowed steadily, showing the same static hallways, the same empty rooms. I checked my watch again. 12 a.m. I sat frozen, staring at the numbers, unable to make sense of them. I'd walked into the eastern hallway at 3:17. By my memory, I hadn't been gone more than 10-15 minutes at most. Yet the shift was nearly over. Hours had passed in what felt like moments. The logbook was open on the desk, the pen lying where I'd left it. But on the page, in handwriting that wasn't mine, one sentence had been scrawled across the margin. You shouldn't have gone. I slammed the book shut and sat rigid until the sun finally rose, the pale light bleeding into the booth. My body ached like I'd been beaten, my head throbbing with the weight of too many voices crammed into a space too small. By the time I drove home, I understood something I hadn't before. The rules weren't boundaries to protect me from superstition. They were the only thing standing between me and whatever lived inside those walls. And now, after breaking them twice, I was no longer sure they could protect me at all. Sleep became something I remembered rather than something I experienced. At first, I told myself I was just shaken, that a few nights of bad rest were natural after what I'd seen in the eastern hallway. But the truth was simpler. I couldn't sleep because every time I closed my eyes, I felt the building. It was as though the facility had burrowed into my thoughts, stretching out its endless corridors inside my skull. When I did manage to drift off, I dreamed of cameras. Rows and rows of monitors stacked higher than sight, each one showing me from different angles. In one dream, I watched myself sleeping, then realized the camera was above my bed. I woke in a cold sweat, gasping, the sensation of being observed lingering in the room like a smell that wouldn't clear. My apartment changed with me. It became less a place to live and more an extension of the booth. The walls grew paper thin under the weight of all the notes I tacked to them. Sheets of paper covered every surface, filled with times, dates, maps of the facility I'd sketched from memory. I traced patterns in where the shadows appeared on the monitors, compared them against the patrol logs, searched for meaning that never quite revealed itself. The eastern hallway appeared more often in my drawings than anything else. Sometimes it stretched across the page endlessly. Other times it branched into impossible geometries, stairwells that doubled back into themselves, doors that opened into black voids. I knew I was exaggerating, maybe even hallucinating, but when I drew them, the rooms felt real, tangible. Friends noticed. They asked questions I couldn't answer without sounding insane. "You're thinner," one of them said when we met for coffee. "You look hollow." I forced a smile and told him the job was just rough. Long hours, nothing serious. He nodded, but his eyes lingered too long, filled with the kind of worry I didn't want to face. Even off duty, I wasn't free. Shadows followed me home, though I never saw them directly. My peripheral vision picked up movement, a figure slipping behind a corner, a reflection in a window. But when I turned, there was nothing. Sometimes walking down my street at night, I'd hear the faint click of static behind me, as though a monitor were flicking on in the dark. The line between waking and dreaming thinned. I'd be halfway through writing a report before realizing I was sitting at my kitchen table, not the booth. I'd wake with pen marks on my hands, notes written in jagged scrawl I didn't remember leaving. The worst part wasn't the fear. It was the certainty growing inside me, heavy and relentless. I wasn't merely recording what I saw. The act of watching was changing me. One night, around 2 a.m., I woke standing in front of my bathroom mirror. I didn't remember getting out of bed. My reflection stared back, pale, gaunt, eyes sunken, but it wasn't in sync. My head tilted a second later than my own movement. My mouth opened slightly as if forming words, but no sound came. I smashed the mirror with my fist before I could see what came next. Blood dripped into the sink. I wrapped my hand in a towel and sat on the floor, rocking slightly, staring at the shards glittering on the tiles. Every piece reflected me, but none of the faces matched. At work, the facility seemed to sense my unraveling. The cameras glitched more often. Cold spots spread across the hallways, lingering longer, crawling under my skin. Doors rattled as I passed them, though I never saw anyone inside. Sometimes I'd hear my own voice echoing faintly down corridors I hadn't walked yet, repeating sentences I hadn't spoken. I told myself I could quit. That was the rational option. Walk away, let someone else shoulder the burden. But the thought of leaving felt impossible. Not because of the money anymore, but because the building wouldn't let me. Even on days off, I found myself driving past it, parking outside just to stare at the dark windows. I tried avoiding the eastern hallway after 3:15, but it didn't matter. The building had seeped into every hallway, every wall. Once, while patrolling the ground floor, I opened a supply closet and found the impossible. The same metal shelves from that room I'd stumbled into, stacked with boxes labeled in the same unreadable script. I slammed the door shut, heart hammering, and when I reopened it seconds later, the shelves were gone. It wasn't confined anymore. By the 11th night, my sketches filled nearly every wall of my apartment. Strings of red thread connected notes and diagrams, spiraling across the living room like a web. I wasn't searching for answers anymore. I was trying to map a labyrinth that shifted every time I thought I understood it. I hadn't slept properly in days. I couldn't eat. My body was running on caffeine, adrenaline, and the sickly pull of something I couldn't name. And through it all, a single thought whispered at the edge of my mind, steady and insistent. The building isn't just bending reality, it's bending me. The storm rolled in long before the power went out. I remember the way the wind pressed against the windows, how the glass trembled faintly, vibrating as though it wanted to crack. Rain hit the building in sheets, pouring down the concrete walls and echoing through the empty corridors like distant applause. From the booth, I watched lightning split the sky on the monitors, illuminating the compound outside in quick, violent flashes. It was around midnight when the first flicker hit. The overhead lights dimmed, then surged back brighter than before. A hum rattled through the electrical lines in the walls, a low groan that sank into my chest. For a moment I thought it would stabilize, that the facility would hold, but the storm outside only grew worse. At 12:17 a.m., everything went dark. The silence was immediate and crushing. No soft buzz of fluorescent lights, no quiet clicking from the cameras, no steady whir of the old heating system, just my own breathing and the distant rumble of thunder. Then the emergency lights blinked on, dim red strips along the floor, bathing the hallways in blood-colored glow. I should have stayed in the booth. That's what protocol demanded. Sit tight until the backup generator kicked in. But the cameras were useless now. Every screen blank, and the thought of sitting in that chair blind while the building pressed closer around me. I couldn't. So I took the flashlight from the desk, its beam narrow and unreliable, and began my patrol. The halls looked different in the blackout. Shadows stretched longer, bleeding into corners that seemed deeper than they should have been. The air was heavy, thick with dampness from the storm outside, carrying the faint smell of earth and mold, as though the walls themselves were sweating. My footsteps echoed unnaturally loud against the concrete floor, bouncing back with a delay that made me feel like something was following me just a few steps behind. On the second floor, I heard the first sound, a faint scrape like fingernails dragging across metal. I froze, swung the flashlight toward the noise, but the beam fell only on a closed supply closet. The sound stopped the second I looked. I waited, my breath caught in my throat until the silence grew unbearable. Then I moved on. The storm outside raged harder. The whole building seemed to sway with the wind, groaning under the weight of rain. Lightning flashed through the thin slits of reinforced windows, and for an instant I thought I saw a shape pressed against the glass. Pale hands spread wide, a blurred face watching me from the other side. But when the flash faded, the window showed nothing but rain streaks. I told myself it was just reflections. Just my exhaustion, but I couldn't shake the chill spreading through my chest. By 1 a.m., I'd made it to the eastern hallway. The rule, never walk there after 3:15, echoed in my mind, but I wasn't breaking it this time. Not yet. The corridor was empty, bathed in red glow, the doors lining its sides all shut. Still, I couldn't stop the sense of wrongness that grew with each step I took closer. The air was colder here, my breath visible in faint white puffs. That's when the lights went out completely. No red glow, no dim strips along the floor, just pure black. I froze, swallowed hard, and flicked on the flashlight. The beam cut through the dark, illuminating the nearest stretch of corridor. My pulse thudded in my ears as I turned slowly, scanning the hallway, every nerve braced for something I didn't want to see. The sound came again, not scraping this time, but footsteps. Slow, heavy, deliberate. They were behind me. I spun the light around, but the beam caught only empty corridor. Still, the footsteps continued, echoing just behind me, always at the edge of the darkness. I backed up, flashlight trembling in my grip, until my shoulder brushed against a doorframe. That's when I saw it. Not directly, not fully. Just a glimpse. Pale fingers curling around the corner at the far end of the hall. Too many joints bending in angles that made my stomach lurch. They slipped back into the dark before I could even process what I'd seen. But the image burned itself into my mind. I ran. The flashlight beam bounced wildly across the walls as I sprinted down the corridor. Footsteps slamming behind me, faster now, closing in. I turned corners blindly, desperate to put space between myself and whatever hunted me. But the building betrayed me. Every hallway looked the same, repeating, looping back, trapping me in an endless red and black maze. I ducked into a stairwell, slamming the door shut behind me. My breath came in ragged gasps, sweat chilling my skin. For a moment there was only silence. Then faintly from the other side of the door came the sound of breathing. Not mine. It was deep, rattling, wet, as though every inhale dragged across waterlogged lungs. It pressed close against the door, filling the stairwell with its rhythm. I held the flashlight tight against my chest, afraid even the faint glow might give me away. My whole body trembled as I listened. And then, just as suddenly, the breathing stopped. Silence again. I waited 5 minutes before moving, though it felt like an eternity. When I finally forced myself down the stairs, the flashlight beam shaking across the steps, I realized something that nearly broke me. Every exit was sealed. The front doors, the loading dock, even the fire escapes, all locked, bolted from the inside with chains I had never seen before. I yanked at them until my palms burned, but nothing budged. That was when the mirrors began. Every reflective surface, windows, glass cabinets, even the shine of wet floor tiles, showed more than they should. My reflection lagged, twisted, sometimes multiplied into dozens of versions of myself staring back. In one broken shard of glass, I saw not my face at all, but a stretched figure with static, where features should have been. I stumbled back into the main corridor, heart racing, only to hear the footsteps again. Not just behind me this time, but all around, circling, closing in. The air grew colder, the red lights flickering weakly back to life, painting the walls like veins pulsing with dim blood. Something moved just beyond the reach of the flashlight. Tall, thin, wrong. I ducked into an office, slammed the door shut and crawled under the desk, pressing myself into the corner. The flashlight flickered, its battery dying, and I killed it completely, leaving myself in darkness. The handle turned. I held my breath as the door creaked open, the sound of bare feet on tile. Slow, deliberate steps crossing the room. I could smell it now, where damp earth, rot, the stench of old water trapped in stagnant places. The footsteps stopped just in front of the desk. Silence. I closed my eyes, every muscle in my body locked. Then slowly, impossibly, the desk shifted. Just an inch, maybe two, dragged by something not strong enough to move it fully, but strong enough to let me know it was there. I nearly screamed, but bit down hard on my tongue instead, the taste of blood filling my mouth. The footsteps retreated. The door clicked shut. I don't know how long I stayed under that desk, an hour, maybe two. When I finally emerged, the emergency lights had steadied again, casting the hallways back into dim red glow. The footsteps were gone. The silence returned. But the building didn't feel empty anymore. It felt alive. And it wanted me to know that the blackout wasn't a failure of power. It was an invitation. By the time the blackout ended, I no longer trusted the lights. Every flicker overhead felt like a trick. Every hum of power through the walls like the breath of something waiting, patient and calculating. The building hadn't gone back to normal. It had only changed the rules again, letting me believe I was safer than I was. That night, the 11th shift, I told myself I would last until morning. Just one more round. Just one more patrol. The cameras buzzed weakly in the booth, static bleeding across their surfaces like frost. Shapes flickered in frames where nothing should be moving. I forced myself not to look too closely. I didn't want to see what might already be watching me. Still, the eastern hallway drew me like gravity. I'd avoided it since the blackout, but the pull was stronger now, almost physical. My body felt guided toward it, step after step echoing through the facility, each one less my choice and more an inevitability. By 2:45 a.m., I was standing at its threshold. The hallway stretched ahead, bathed in faint red glow. The air was colder than anywhere else in the building, thin and sharp in my lungs. My flashlight beam wavered against the walls, showing peeling paint, warped tiles, doors shut tight as if hiding something inside. I walked. Every few feet, the corridor seemed to shift. A door would appear where there hadn't been one, or vanish entirely. The floor dipped, tilted, corrected itself. I checked my watch compulsively. 2:58. Siono, point 11. When 3:15 came, the change was instant. The lights overhead guttered, then steadied in a dim, sickly glow. The hallway seemed longer now, stretching out farther than the building should have allowed. My footsteps echoed endlessly, bouncing back with a delay that made it sound like someone followed just behind. And then, I saw it. At first, it was only a shadow at the far end of the hall, tall and thin, still as a cutout pasted against the wall. My breath caught in my throat as the beam of the flashlight trembled across it. The figure stepped forward. It was humanoid in the loosest sense. Too tall, arms too long. The legs bent but not correctly. Its face was a blur of static, shifting constantly, features forming and dissolving before I could recognize them. When it moved, the air grew colder, pressing against me like water. I stumbled back, turned, and ran. but every corner I took led me back into the same hallway. Doors slammed shut when I reached them, their handles twisting violently out of reach. I sprinted, panting, flashlight beam careening across warped walls. But no matter how fast I moved, the shadow remained behind me, steady, patient, closing the distance without ever rushing. By the fourth turn, panic had hollowed me out. The building was folding in on itself, corralling me back toward it. Finally, I burst through a door into the security office, slamming it shut and shoving the desk against it. My chest heaved, sweat dripping into my eyes, the stink of rot and damp still clinging to my clothes. The monitors flared to life. All at once, every screen filled with images, not of the hallways, not of the building, but of me. Dozens of versions of myself stared back, each slightly wrong. One smiled too wide, another's eyes were black pits, a third pressed its face close to the glass, lips moving soundlessly in words I couldn't hear. I stumbled back, bile rising in my throat. The static surged, loud enough to drown out my own heartbeat. On one monitor, I watched myself cowering in the office, but the angle was impossible, as though a camera hung directly above me. I looked up. Nothing. But when I looked back, the figure filled the screen. Its static face leaned close, flickering, watching me as though the glass were only a thin veil between us. One pale hand pressed against the inside of the monitor, the surface rippling like water under its touch. The desk behind me rattled. The door handle twisted, jerking violently. The pounding began, slow at first, then faster, harder, until the entire office shook with every blow. I pressed myself into the corner, flashlight dead, useless. The monitor screamed static, and the figure pressed closer, filling every screen with its distorted shape. Then, in the sudden silence between the pounding, it spoke. Not aloud, not in sound, but inside my head. You've been watching. The words weren't words at all. They were a sensation, a pressure, a crawling electricity under my skin. Now it's your turn. The monitors blacked out all at once. The door burst inward. I never saw its face clearly. I only felt the air vanish, the room bending around me, every screen erupting back to life with hundreds of my reflections, screaming silently, pounding against glass, trying to warn me of something I couldn't understand. The office folded in on itself. Corridors bleeding into walls, walls bleeding into void. My own body stretched, warped in every monitor, multiplied into infinite versions that all watched me at once. I closed my eyes, desperate for the dark, but even then, I wasn't alone. If you're hearing this, then maybe I made it out, or maybe I didn't. I can't tell anymore. I'm sitting here writing down everything I remember, but the timeline doesn't hold steady. Some parts feel like days ago, others like they're still happening around me. The walls shift if I stare too long, and sometimes I hear the faint buzz of the monitors even when I'm not in the building. Maybe I never left the security office. Maybe I never left that hallway. The last thing I clearly recall is the door breaking, the pounding stopping all at once, and then silence so deep it pressed against my bones. I remember falling back into the chair, head in my hands, waiting for it to come for me. But when I lifted my eyes, I was here, at this desk at home with pen and paper in front of me. And yet, I don't trust this place either. The apartment doesn't feel like mine anymore. The air is too cold, carrying that faint smell of mold and wet concrete. The light from the lamp flickers like the emergency strips in the hallways. When I close my eyes, I can trace every corridor of the facility, every room I walked, every monitor I watched. They're burned into me like scars. I think the building follows. At night, I wake to the sound of footsteps in my hallway. My own hallway, the narrow one that leads from the kitchen to the bedroom. I'll get up, open the door, shine a flashlight, but nothing is ever there. Just silence, stretching too long as if waiting for me to breathe first. Sometimes the silence breaks. A whisper, faint, in the same voice I use when I'm talking to myself, only a beat out of sync. It calls my name, not angrily, not urgently, just reminding me. I've noticed reflections don't line up anymore. The bathroom mirror shows me looking tired, bloodshot, hollow, but always just a second late. When I tilt my head, it tilts after. When I speak, its lips don't move. And sometimes, when I'm not looking, I catch it smiling. I smashed the last mirror, but the fragments still hold pieces of me. Different pieces. None of them whole. I tried calling the company. The number I had for the supervisor only rang into static. I drove by the facility once, Swore I wouldn't go inside, just wanted to see it from the outside again. But when I pulled up to the gate, the building wasn't there. Just an empty lot, concrete cracked, weeds growing through. No windows, no lights, no booth. As if it had never existed, and yet, I can still smell the place. I can still hear the hum of the monitors when I close my eyes. I can still feel the weight of its gaze. I don't know if this account will ever reach anyone. Maybe someone will find these pages when I'm gone. Maybe another guard will sit where I sat, read the same rules, ask the same questions, and ignore the same warnings. If you are that person, if you're reading this, listen carefully. The rules are not arbitrary. The rules are not traditions or protocols. They are warnings. Do not look at the third-floor monitor. Do not walk the eastern hallway after 3:15 a.m. Do not answer if you hear your own voice calling from somewhere it shouldn't. They only delay it. They cannot stop it. You'll think you're safe if you follow them. But the truth is simpler and much worse. The building isn't contained by its walls. It isn't locked behind chains and doors. Once it notices you, once you see it, really see it, the rules won't matter. It will follow, and you won't know when the night ends. Or if it ever does. I keep writing because it's the only thing that feels real anymore. Each word ties me to this page, to this pen, to the last fragments of myself. But even as I write, I see movement at the edge of my vision, shadows leaning closer, fingers curling around the doorway. The monitors are flickering in my mind again, rows and rows stacked endlessly. And on every single screen I'm there, writing, watching, waiting. If you're hearing this, if you're reading this, then maybe you'll be the next one to sit in the chair. Maybe you already have. The silence around me is too loud now. I think it's here. I think it's always been here, and I don't know if I ever left.